You call your dog, and for a split second, they don't move. It's subtle, almost easy to ignore, but something has already changed in that moment. Because a dog that used to respond instantly is now hesitating, even if only for a second. And that hesitation is not random, it's information. Most owners brush this off because the dog still comes eventually. They assume the delay means nothing, or maybe just distraction or mood. But what looks like a small pause is often the very first visible shift in how your dog is thinking. And once it starts, it rarely stays small. Because dogs don't suddenly stop responding overnight. They don't wake up one day and decide to ignore you. Instead, the change begins in these tiny, almost invisible moments. Moments where the automatic response becomes a considered one. At first, it's just a fraction of a second. You call, and your dog looks at you but doesn't move right away. Then maybe they glance away briefly or finish what they were doing before responding. And over time, that delay slowly becomes longer. What you are seeing is the difference between reflex and evaluation. A dog that responds instantly is not thinking about whether to come. It simply does, because the decision has already been made before the call even happens. But when a pause appears, it means the dog is now processing the situation in real time. They are asking a silent question, not consciously in words, but clearly in behavior. Is this worth responding to right now? And that question changes everything. Because once a dog begins to evaluate instead of respond, the relationship shifts. It moves from automatic alignment to conditional engagement. And that shift doesn't happen loudly, it happens quietly, right in front of you. Hidden inside a moment most people dismiss. And this is where most owners miss what's really happening. The pause is not staying the same, even if it feels like it is. Because while you're noticing the hesitation, your dog is learning something else entirely. It's learning that responding is no longer automatic. That's the shift that matters. Not the delay itself, but what the delay teaches over time. Because once a dog realizes it can choose when to respond, the entire dynamic begins to change. And that change does not reverse on its own. The pause is not about disobedience. It's not about stubbornness or attitude. It's about clarity, or more accurately, the loss of it. Because dogs respond fastest when the environment feels predictable and consistent. When your actions, tone, and presence all align, the dog doesn't need to think. It already understands what your call means and what follows next. But when that clarity starts to fade, hesitation begins to appear. Not as rebellion, but as uncertainty. And uncertainty always slows response. Not just in dogs, but in any thinking system. Because when the outcome becomes less predictable, the brain pauses before acting. And that's exactly what you're seeing. Sometimes it starts when commands are repeated too often. The dog hears the same cue multiple times before anything happens. So instead of responding immediately, it begins to wait. Not out of defiance, but because waiting has become part of the pattern. Other times, it comes from inconsistency. One moment the call is important, the next moment, it isn't. Sometimes the dog is rewarded for responding. Other times, nothing follows. And slowly, the meaning of the call becomes unclear. So the dog begins to check first. It looks, observes, and processes before deciding. And that processing creates the pause you're starting to notice. A pause that didn't exist before. In some cases, the environment plays a role. There may be something more interesting, more engaging, or more rewarding nearby. And when that happens, the dog compares options before moving. Not emotionally, but logically, based on experience. Because dogs are constantly learning from outcomes. They remember what follows certain actions. They track patterns far more closely than most owners realize. And they adjust their behavior accordingly. And this is where the shift deepens even further. Because once a dog begins comparing outcomes, your voice becomes just one signal among many. It is no longer the primary reference point it once was. And that changes how the dog prioritizes every decision. At this stage, hesitation becomes more than a pause. It becomes a habit. The dog no longer reacts instantly, even in familiar situations. It begins to apply the same evaluation process everywhere. You may notice the dog watching you more before moving. Not out of confusion, but out of calculation. It is reading your body language, your tone, your consistency. trying to determine what your call actually means this time. And this is where most owners feel something is off, but can't explain why. The dog is still responding, but it feels different. Slower, less certain, less connected. And that feeling is accurate. Because what has changed is not obedience, it's alignment. The dog is no longer moving with you automatically. It is now moving after deciding. At first, this difference is small, almost too small to matter, but behavior builds on itself. And small changes, when repeated, become the new normal. The dog begins to respond selectively. Faster in some situations, slower in others. More engaged at times, more distant at others. And this inconsistency reflects what it is learning. Because from the dog's perspective, not all moments are equal anymore. Some calls matter more than others. Some responses lead to something, others lead to nothing. And that uneven pattern creates hesitation. And once hesitation becomes part of the system, the relationship changes shape. Not dramatically at first, but gradually, quietly, in ways that are easy to miss until they are established. You may start to notice other signs. The dog doesn't check in as often. It takes longer to reconnect after distraction. It becomes slightly more independent in movement. None of these feel serious on their own. Each one seems like a small variation in behavior, but together they form a clear direction. And that direction always starts the same way, with a pause. The most important part is this. The dog is not pulling away emotionally. It is adjusting its decision-making process, from automatic to selective. That's why the pause matters so much. Not because of what it is, but because of what it leads to. If nothing changes, the gap continues to grow. Over time, the delay becomes more noticeable. The dog may start choosing when to respond. It may ignore certain calls entirely in specific situations. And what once felt effortless now requires effort. And this is where most owners finally notice something has changed. Not because the pause just appeared, but because it has grown enough to be impossible to ignore. The response feels slower, less certain, less connected than it used to be. And that feeling is not imagined. It's the result of everything that has been building quietly. But the truth is, the change didn't start here. It started much earlier, in a moment that felt too small to matter. A single hesitation that passed in seconds and was quickly forgotten. Yet that moment carried the direction of everything that followed. Because dogs don't shift all at once. They shift in layers, and each layer builds on the last. What begins as a pause becomes a pattern, and what becomes a pattern reshapes the entire response. Not suddenly, but steadily, until it becomes the new normal. And that's why this moment matters more than it seems. Not because the pause itself is a problem, but because it reveals how your dog is now processing you. It shows that something has moved from automatic to conditional. And once that shift happens, everything begins to feel different. But here's what most people miss. The pause is not resistance, and it's not disobedience. It's a signal that the dog is no longer certain enough to act instantly. And certainty is what drives speed, not pressure, not repetition, not force. So when that certainty fades, hesitation takes its place. The dog looks, processes, and decides instead of moving immediately. And that decision-making is what you're seeing in that brief moment of stillness. A moment that seems small, but carries far more meaning than it appears. Because from the dog's perspective, that pause is logical. It reflects everything it has learned about outcomes, patterns, and consistency. It is not random, and it is not emotional in the way most people assume. It is structured, built from experience. And once you see it that way, the moment becomes clearer. It's no longer confusing or frustrating. It becomes something you can recognize early before it grows into something more noticeable. Before hesitation becomes habit. Because the difference between a dog that responds instantly and one that hesitates is not time. It's clarity. And clarity is what determines whether the dog moves without thinking or stops to evaluate. That's why this moment matters, because it shows you exactly where that clarity stands. Not in theory, but in real behavior, right in front of you. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So the next time you call your dog, watch carefully. Not just for whether they come, but for what happens before they move. Because in that brief pause, your dog is telling you everything.